The Luftwaffe was never the invincible force wartime propaganda claimed it to be. Archival records reveal a command structure strained by politics, resource shortages, and flawed doctrine long before Allied bombers reached German skies. What appeared as brilliance in 1940 masked an unsustainable war of attrition by 1943. Let's uncover the 10 myths about the Luftwaffe that history never told in full. 1. The Luftwaffe was the most advanced air force in the world. For decades, the Luftwaffe has been remembered as a symbol of German technological superiority, a force years ahead of its time. Textbooks often describe it as the first modern air arm, flawlessly coordinated, equipped with revolutionary aircraft, and guided by visionary leadership. But archival records and post-war analyses reveal a different story. By the time war began in 1939, the Luftwaffe was already strategically outdated. This misconception began with early propaganda films and Allied reporting during the Blitz. The sight of Stukas diving over Poland and France seemed to embody a terrifying new form of warfare. In truth, the Luftwaffe's apparent dominance reflected Germany's focus on short, rapid campaigns, not long-range air superiority. When Hermann Göring rebuilt the force in the 1930s, his doctrine emphasized close air support for the army rather than strategic bombing or sustained aerial defense. This design suited the lightning wars of 1939 and 1940, but left the Luftwaffe unprepared for a prolonged global conflict. Evidence from captured Reich Air Ministry documents confirms these structural flaws. In 1937, planners canceled long-range bomber projects such as the Dornier Do-19 and Junkers Ju-89, shifting production to medium bombers like the Heinkel He-111 and the Junkers Ju-88. These aircraft lacked the range and payload needed for deep strikes against industrial centers. By contrast, the Royal Air Force and the U.S. Army Air Forces later fielded heavy bombers capable of reaching continental targets. Records also show chronic shortages of advanced materials and engines, with production repeatedly hampered by bureaucratic rivalry and Göring's interference. The Luftwaffe's technological edge in 1939 was real but narrow, and it vanished quickly as Allied industry scaled up. Historians now agree that the Luftwaffe's early success was operational, not strategic. Its aircraft were designed to support the Wehrmacht's rapid ground advances, not to fight a long-range war of attrition. When that war came, over Britain, the Soviet Union, and later Germany itself, the Luftwaffe's limitations became fatal. What had seemed like innovation was, in truth, a misreading of the coming conflict. The myth of superiority concealed a force built for victories that could not last. This misunderstanding laid the foundation for the next illusion: the belief that Germany lost air superiority only after Allied bombing intensified. 2. The Luftwaffe lost air superiority only after 1943? Popular accounts often suggest that Germany dominated the skies until the middle of the war and only lost air superiority once American bombers arrived in Europe. This timeline comforts the idea of a dramatic turning point, a sudden collapse after years of dominance. Yet military records and post-war intelligence studies reveal that the Luftwaffe's decline began far earlier, in both numbers and doctrine. The myth emerged from wartime propaganda and selective reporting. Early German victories over Poland, France, and the Low Countries created the illusion of complete aerial supremacy. Newsreels celebrated the Luftwaffe as unstoppable, while Allied governments downplayed their own early weaknesses. But the Battle of Britain in 1940 shattered this image. Declassified British and German records show that by September of that year, the Luftwaffe had lost over 1,700 aircraft, a quarter of its operational strength. Pilot losses were irreplaceable. Many veterans who had trained before the war were gone, replaced by underqualified recruits. Operational diaries reveal further weaknesses during the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. The Luftwaffe entered the campaign with around 2,700 operational aircraft, but faced a front stretching over 1,800 miles. Logistical collapse, harsh weather, and overextension destroyed hundreds of planes without enemy contact. Production data from the Reich Air Ministry show that by 1942, output could not keep pace with losses. German aircraft factories were producing quantity, but not endurance. Meanwhile, Allied production surged. American industry built more than 47,000 aircraft that year alone. By the time of Stalingrad, German pilots were already fighting at a numerical disadvantage. Reports from Luftwaffe 4 describe entire squadrons grounded due to fuel shortages and inadequate maintenance. The notion of air superiority until 1943 dissolves under the weight of these figures. What truly changed in 1943 was not Germany's loss of dominance. It was the Allies' ability to make that defeat visible. Understanding this timeline reveals that the Luftwaffe's collapse was not sudden, but systemic. It began with attrition, worsened through overextension, and became irreversible long before the Allied bombers reached Berlin. The next myth explains why even the Luftwaffe's most celebrated campaign, the Battle of Britain, was built on fragile foundations. 3. The Battle of Britain was lost only because of strategic mistakes. The common explanation for the Luftwaffe's failure over Britain centers on Göring's decision to shift attacks from airfields to London. Many historians have repeated this story as the defining blunder that cost Germany victory in 1940. But contemporary documents and post-war interviews indicate that the failure was not the result of one decision. It was structural, born of intelligence misjudgments, logistical limits, and flawed aircraft design. The myth originated in early post-war narratives that sought simplicity in defeat. The story of a single error, bombing London, allowed German officers to blame leadership while preserving the myth of operational excellence. Yet records from Luftwaffe 2 and Luftwaffe 3 reveal a deeper truth. The Luftwaffe entered the campaign with aircraft that lacked range and endurance. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Luftwaffe's main fighter, could stay over British skies for less than 20 minutes before needing to return to France. Bomber formations were often left exposed, and German losses mounted even when targets were correctly chosen. British Fighter Command, under Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, operated within an integrated radar and communications network. German intelligence had underestimated this system. Reports from the Abwehr before the campaign described British airfields and aircraft production as limited and vulnerable. In reality, the network allowed rapid interception, preserving British strength while draining German resources. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey and captured German records confirm that the Luftwaffe's losses were unsustainable by mid-September 1940. Between July and October, Germany lost over 1,700 aircraft and nearly 3,000 trained airmen. Aircraft production could not recover these losses before the Soviet campaign began in 1941. The decision to bomb London was indeed a tactical mistake, but it was made within a failing strategy. The Luftwaffe could not sustain the range, fuel, or pilot training needed for prolonged air war. The myth of a single error conceals a deeper truth. Germany had designed its air force for short victories, not for endurance against an industrial power. This realization links directly to the next illusion: the belief that German industry could have replaced those losses through its vast wartime production. 4. Germany's aircraft industry could have sustained the war effort. For decades, wartime propaganda and later interpretations have portrayed Germany as a nation of near-limitless industrial capability. The idea that its aircraft industry could have sustained the Luftwaffe through strategic bombing campaigns persists even among serious historians. But archival production data and Allied intelligence reports from the Combined Strategic Targets Committee tell a different story, one of fragmentation, inefficiency, and political interference. The myth traces back to Nazi propaganda films and speeches by Armaments Minister Albert Speer, who claimed post-war that he had revolutionized production efficiency. However, German records captured after 1945 contradict these claims. The Reich's aviation industry never reached the rationalized mass production model achieved by the United States or Britain. Instead, production remained dispersed among dozens of firms, often competing for resources rather than cooperating. Evidence from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946, shows that aircraft output fluctuated erratically. While 1944 saw record production numbers, these figures masked declining quality and reduced pilot readiness. Many new aircraft left factories unfinished or were grounded due to fuel shortages. The Me-262 jet fighter, often cited as a technological marvel that could have changed the war, suffered from shortages of heat-resistant alloys and unreliable engines. Fewer than 300 entered combat service in effective condition. Documents from the Luftwaffe's Quartermaster General reveal severe bottlenecks in engine production. The Jumo 211 and BMW 801 engines faced constant supply shortages, while transport breakdowns delayed assembly lines. Allied bombing intensified these problems, but internal mismanagement was already crippling output long before 1944. Additionally, Göring's habit of diverting aircraft to politically favored regions and his refusal to prioritize training aircraft meant that many factories built planes faster than Germany could train pilots to fly them. By 1943, the Luftwaffe's industrial capacity had reached a paradox. More planes were being built, but fewer could fly. Maintenance, fuel, and spare parts collapsed under strain. The myth of industrial resilience concealed a production system strangled by inefficiency and hierarchy. This truth leads to the next, equally persistent illusion, that German pilots retained qualitative superiority even as their numbers dwindled. 5. German pilots remained the best in the world until the end. The image of the elite German fighter ace, disciplined, fearless, and technically unmatched, has endured for generations. Figures like Erich Hartmann and Adolf Galland have been celebrated as symbols of enduring superiority amid defeat. Yet the historical record paints a far more complex picture. The Luftwaffe's pilot corps deteriorated rapidly after 1942, not from lack of courage, but from training collapse and systemic exhaustion. The myth originated in post-war memoirs and selective reporting. Many surviving German pilots published accounts emphasizing individual heroism while omitting the desperate conditions under which they fought. Wartime propaganda had already elevated the ace image, portraying Luftwaffe pilots as a knightly order defending the Reich's skies. But by mid-1943, this image no longer reflected reality. Training records from the Luftwaffe's flying schools show a dramatic decline in instructional hours. In 1940, new pilots averaged over 240 flight hours before deployment. By 1944, that number had fallen below 110. Fuel shortages and Allied attacks on training bases forced Germany to cut programs short. Many pilots went into combat with minimal experience in formation tactics or instrument flying. Allied intercept reports confirm that novice German pilots often made basic errors, such as climbing too steeply into combat or failing to conserve fuel. Meanwhile, Allied pilot training improved through standardized programs and combat rotation. American and British pilots logged more flight hours before combat and returned to teach new recruits after their tours. The Luftwaffe had no such rotation. Experienced flyers remained on the front lines until they were killed. By 1944, more than half of the Luftwaffe's pilots were under 21 years old. Combat reports from Jagdgeschwader units show the decline in effectiveness. Units that once achieved favorable kill ratios were suffering catastrophic losses. Despite technical advances like the FW-190 and Me-262, the skill gap widened. Numbers tell the story. In 1944 alone, the Luftwaffe lost 17,000 pilots and aircrew, losses that training programs could never replace. The myth of the invincible ace persisted because it gave meaning to defeat. But the reality was one of exhaustion, attrition, and irreversible decline. Behind the legend stood a generation of young men trained too quickly, sent too early, and lost too soon. From here, the narrative turns to the Luftwaffe's final illusion, that Germany's defeat in the air was purely a result of Allied bombing, rather than the consequence of its own flawed foundation. 6. The Luftwaffe's anti-air defenses could have stopped Allied bombing. In many wartime accounts, the Luftwaffe's anti-aircraft network, the famed Flak, is described as an impregnable shield, feared even by seasoned Allied crews. Popular documentaries and memoirs often credit it with inflicting catastrophic losses and nearly halting Allied bombing in 1943 and 1944. Yet German military archives and post-war Allied analyses reveal that the flak system, while massive, was inefficient, strategically misused, and ultimately unsustainable. The belief in its strength stemmed from both propaganda and the visible reality of its scale. Berlin, Hamburg, and the Ruhr Valley bristled with thousands of heavy guns, their black bursts marking the sky in every photograph of the bombing war. Nazi propaganda emphasized these defenses as symbols of national resilience. Civilian morale campaigns featured slogans claiming that flak protects the home. But records from the Reich Air Defense Command tell a different story. By late 1943, Germany had deployed over 55,000 heavy anti-aircraft guns and consumed nearly half its artillery production maintaining them. The cost was staggering. Each 88mm gun required a crew of at least 10 men and vast quantities of ammunition. Declassified economic reports show that by 1944, anti-aircraft defense consumed more steel, manpower, and explosives than the entire Panzer program. Despite this investment, effectiveness declined. A 1944 German Air Ministry assessment estimated that it took over 16,000 shells to shoot down a single Allied bomber. The flak arm suffered from chronic shortages of radar, predictor systems, and ammunition quality. Training standards fell sharply as younger, less experienced soldiers replaced veterans sent to the front. Reports from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey after the war concluded that German flak inflicted only limited damage relative to its enormous cost, serving more as psychological reassurance than genuine defense. Moreover, the diversion of industrial and human resources to sustain the flak network weakened frontline units and aircraft production. The myth of the Iron Shield concealed an uncomfortable truth. Germany defended its skies by exhausting its strength. In the end, the flak towers stood as monuments not to resilience, but to a strategy that mistook noise and spectacle for security. 7. The Luftwaffe could have won the war with jet fighters. Among the most enduring legends of the air war is the claim that the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, could have reversed Germany's defeat if deployed earlier. Enthusiasts still imagine squadrons of these jets sweeping Allied bombers from the skies. However, archival production logs, pilot reports, and technical evaluations reveal that the Me 262 was a remarkable aircraft launched into a crumbling system. Its impact, while impressive on paper, was strategically insignificant. This myth originated during the war itself. Nazi propaganda hailed the Me 262 as a miracle weapon, promising to avenge the bombings of German cities. Post-war memoirs, especially those by Luftwaffe officers like Adolf Galland, reinforced the idea that bureaucratic delays and Hitler's interference, particularly his insistence on using the jet as a bomber, robbed Germany of victory. While Hitler's decision indeed caused confusion, the jet's problems ran deeper. Production data from Messerschmitt factories at Augsburg and Regensburg show severe shortages of key materials. The jet's Junkers Jumo 004 engines required heat-resistant alloys Germany could no longer produce in quantity. Each engine had a lifespan of barely 25 operational hours before failure. Reports from frontline units, such as Commando Nowotny, confirm that mechanical breakdowns caused more losses than combat. Additionally, the Luftwaffe lacked the fuel, trained technicians, and experienced pilots to operate the jets effectively. By early 1945, fewer than 300 Me 262s were airworthy at any time. They achieved notable tactical successes, downing Allied bombers at high speed, but could not alter the strategic balance. Allied fighter escorts adapted quickly, attacking jets during takeoff and landing when they were most vulnerable. The jet's high speed also made formation flying and target interception difficult for poorly trained pilots. Post-war Allied testing confirmed the aircraft's brilliance in design, but emphasized its impracticality in war conditions. The Me-262 represented technological ambition unmoored from logistical reality. The myth of the jet fighter victory endures because it offers a simple "what if" to an otherwise inevitable defeat. Yet the evidence shows that even perfect deployment would not have overcome fuel collapse, pilot shortages, or the overwhelming scale of Allied production. The next illusion grew from similar nostalgia: the belief that the Luftwaffe's command structure remained disciplined and unified throughout the war. 8. The Luftwaffe maintained a unified and efficient command. The Luftwaffe's early victories created an image of centralized precision, a force guided by strategic clarity and technological skill. Wartime films and later histories often portrayed its leadership as professional and scientifically organized. In reality, declassified correspondence from the Reich Air Ministry and post-war testimonies reveal a command structure crippled by rivalry, confusion, and political interference. The foundation of this myth lay in the aura of technical modernity surrounding the Luftwaffe in the late 1930s. As one of the world's first independent air forces, it appeared to embody efficiency. Yet its organization reflected the competing ambitions of Hermann Göring, Ernst Udet, and Erhard Milch. Each controlled overlapping sections of production, procurement, and training. Decisions were frequently delayed or reversed due to personal rivalries. The result was a force that functioned through improvisation, not cohesion. Archival minutes from high-level meetings in 1941 show how political loyalty often outweighed competence. Göring, personally loyal to Hitler, appointed officers for obedience rather than ability. When operational failures mounted after 1942, the command structure fragmented further. The creation of regional Luftflotten, air fleets, produced bureaucratic duplication, and conflicting orders routinely paralyzed responses to Allied bombing. Reports from Luftwaffe Reich in 1944 describe uncoordinated defense operations and communication paralysis during raids on Berlin and the Ruhr. Historians now emphasize the consequences of this fragmentation. Aircraft production suffered as the technical office under Udet prioritized innovation over reliability. Field commanders complained of shortages, while depots hoarded spare parts awaiting authorization. By late 1944, even the allocation of aviation fuel required Hitler's personal approval. The Luftwaffe's command, far from unified, had devolved into a tangle of fiefdoms. This internal disarray was not fully visible to Allied intelligence until after the war. Declassified ultra-intercepts indicate that Luftwaffe responses to major raids were often delayed by hours due to overlapping command orders. The myth of disciplined central control masked a culture of bureaucratic chaos. In understanding this dysfunction, we begin to see how the Luftwaffe's final phase became not just a military failure, but an administrative collapse. The next myth reveals the scale of that collapse through the forgotten story of Germany's vanishing fuel reserves. 9. The Luftwaffe was defeated by Allied bombs, not by fuel shortages. Conventional histories often attribute the Luftwaffe's downfall to relentless Allied bombing, the destruction of airfields, factories, and cities. But German war economy records and captured correspondence between the Air Ministry and IG Farben show that the decisive factor was fuel. The Luftwaffe did not simply lose its planes, it lost the means to fly them. This misunderstanding began during the war, when Allied leaders emphasized bombing's visible destruction to justify strategic policy. Photographs of smoking factories and cratered runways became symbols of progress. Yet behind those images, a quieter weapon was taking effect: the systematic targeting of synthetic fuel plants. Germany relied almost entirely on synthetic fuel produced from coal through hydrogenation and Fischer-Tropsch processes. These plants, located at Leuna, Pulitz, and Blechhammer, supplied nearly 90% of aviation fuel. By mid-1944, following Operation Point Blank and the oil campaign, these refineries were under continuous attack. Records from the Reich Ministry of Armaments reveal that aviation fuel output fell from 180,000 tons in May 1944 to less than 10,000 by September. Entire Luftflotten were grounded. A report from General Galland to Göring, dated September 10, 1944, warned that fighter units were functioning at 10% operational capacity. Training flights ceased almost entirely. By the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, fuel shortages had crippled not only the Luftwaffe, but the entire Wehrmacht. Jet units received priority, yet even they flew rarely. Ground crews resorted to mixing low-octane substitutes that damaged engines. When Allied pilots encountered minimal resistance in the skies of 1945, it was not because Germany lacked aircraft, over 2,000 were still on the ground, but because none could fly. The myth of bombing alone obscures the economic strangulation that truly ended the Luftwaffe's power. Allied strategy had evolved into a campaign not just against infrastructure, but against motion itself. In the end, the Luftwaffe did not burn out in combat. It starved in silence. This brings us to the final misconception: the idea that the Luftwaffe's defeat ended with Germany's surrender, when in truth, its legacy shaped the air doctrines of the post-war world. 10. The Luftwaffe's legacy ended in 1945. The fall of Berlin and the surrender of the Third Reich seemed to mark the end of the Luftwaffe's story. To most observers, the air force that once terrorized Europe vanished with the ruins of the Reich. Yet declassified Allied intelligence files, post-war interrogations, and the institutional evolution of Western air forces show that the Luftwaffe's influence extended far beyond its defeat. This myth persisted because the Allied narrative focused on victory and retribution. Publicly, the Luftwaffe was presented as annihilated, a relic of fascist militarism. But behind closed doors, Allied planners recognized the depth of German technical expertise. Operation Lusty, conducted by the U.S. Army Air Forces in 1945, collected over 16,000 Luftwaffe documents and transported hundreds of aircraft and engineers to the United States. Similar British efforts under Operation Surgeon recruited German scientists to analyze radar, jet propulsion, and aerodynamics. These programs laid foundations for post-war research. Data from German high-altitude flight experiments influenced early American and Soviet jet development. The swept-wing designs tested on the Me-262 informed aircraft such as the F-86 Sabre and MiG-15. Luftwaffe tactics manuals on interception and radar coordination directly contributed to NATO's early air defense doctrine. Former Luftwaffe officers, including Galland and Steinhoff, later advised West Germany's Bundesluftwaffe during rearmament in the 1950s, shaping its structure under NATO supervision. The moral dimension of this continuity remains complex. Many German engineers who advanced the jet program had worked under forced labor conditions. Allied intelligence acknowledged this, but prioritized technological gain during the emerging Cold War. The Luftwaffe's ideas, stripped of ideology, survived as part of a new global arms race. Recognizing this continuity reframes the Luftwaffe's defeat. It was not an erasure, but a transformation. A migration of knowledge from a collapsing empire into the arsenals of its former enemies. The air war that ended in 1945 became the foundation of a new one, fought in laboratories and policy rooms rather than in the skies above Europe. And so the 10 myths dissolve into a single sobering truth. Germany's defeat in the air was not merely the loss of machines or men, but the collapse of a system built on illusion, a force that mastered innovation, but misunderstood endurance. History rarely tells everything, but what it leaves behind still defines how we understand power and loss. The Luftwaffe's story reminds us that even the most advanced machines cannot outlast flawed belief and exhausted will. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe and continue uncovering the truths history tried to leave behind.